Well, thank you all for coming and welcome to the Smart City Kids and Smart City Tutors Lower Level ISEE 101 workshop. My name is Leila Smiley. I'm the Director of Education and Operations at Smart City Tutors, and I'm here with my colleague Adriana Payne, who is a K-12 and boarding school admissions consultant at Smart City Kids. So before we get started, I'm going to give a little bit of background on Smart City Kids, Smart City Tutors, and then Adriana and I will introduce ourselves a little bit more deeply. So Smart City Kids is a leading educational consulting company committed to helping students unlock their highest potential and reach their academic goals. For over 20 years, our consultants have successfully guided families through the challenging admissions process, and they have helped students gain admissions to their top choice schools, including K-12, nursery, college, boarding school, and special ed. We take the stress out of the admissions process with concierge level support and personalized programs to fit each student's goals and needs. All of our consultants are former admissions officers at top schools across the country, and they know exactly what it takes to make a successful application. At Smart City Tutors, we teach the skills, strategies, and confidence students need to flourish in the classroom and beyond. In addition to academic support in all areas, we also provide our students with test preparation and executive functioning coaching. Everything we do is geared towards meeting every student's unique needs and academic goals. So just a little bit about me. I am a former elementary school teacher. I taught kindergarten and second grade. And then I realized while I was working there, I loved teaching, but I especially loved group work and one-on-one teaching. And so then I transitioned into tutoring. I started with academics and then I moved into test prep. I've now been tutoring at all levels for the ISEE and the SSAT for several years now. And I'm really excited to share this workshop because I love talking about the ISEE. So Adriana, do you want to share a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yep. So I am an educational consultant, and I stepped into this role after having been an enrollment director at a nursery through 8th grade program. I also had other leadership roles, including being the associate head of the school. And prior to that, I had a first career in corporate communications, but significantly, I am a parent of two who has gone through every single phase of application from nursery school to college, and certainly remember this one well. It wasn't very long ago that one of mine was doing this, so I have that lens as well as a parent.
Great. And before we get started, I also want to share a promotion for the attendees of this workshop. So if you'd like to move forward with tutoring, we are offering a 5th session free when you purchase a package of 4 or more. So if you're interested in that, you can follow up with me after the workshop. All right, so let's jump in. So today we're going to be talking all about the lower level ISEE. You're going to leave this workshop knowing what's on the lower level ISEE, when your child will take the lower level ISEE, how the test is used in admissions, and how to ensure your child is ready for the lower level ISEE. So to begin, what is this test? The ISEE stands for the Independent School Entrance Exam. So there's several levels. Today we're talking about lower level, but there's also middle and upper for admission into middle and high school. It's hosted by the ERB, that's the Educational Records Bureau. And the test is about 2.5 hours. It's a little bit shorter than that, but there's a couple breaks, so it comes out to about 2.5 hours. And it's a 5-section test. There's 4 multiple choice sections and 1 essay. So here's a breakdown. We're going to dive a bit more into these sections, but just so you get an overview of the test. The first section is verbal reasoning. That's 34 questions. They have 20 minutes to answer those. The second is quantitative reasoning. That's the first math section. 38 questions, 35 minutes. Then the reading comprehension section, there's 5 passages, 25 questions total, 25 minutes. Math achievement, here's the second math section, 30 questions, 30 minutes. And finally, it ends with 1 essay. They get 1 prompt and they have 30 minutes to complete it. So we're going to dive into all the sections now. So the first,
this is important because people don't understand oftentimes as parents, you don't really understand the nuance of what does verbal reasoning even mean. So take it away. This is important.
Excellent. So verbal reasoning has 2 question types on the lower level ISEE. There are synonyms. So you're given a word and you're asked to pick answer choices that are the closest synonym to the word provided. Then you have the single blank question where they give you a sentence and you have to find the word that fits best into the sentence. So these can be pretty tricky. They have pretty high level vocabulary. I think that's the very first thing to keep in mind, is that even kids who are speaking at like higher levels, who read a lot, there is still a lot of vocabulary your child might not know. And so with that, there's a handful of things we can do to, we'll talk about ways to incorporate those words in. One thing to also know is the test prep strategies are very key here. This, in my opinion, is one of the areas where test prep strategies come in most heavily. So students need to know their multiple choice strategies, especially if you're students at a school that doesn't have those multiple choice tests. You can use process of elimination, context clues, especially in those sentence questions, figuring out like there's lots of little hints and details in the sentences that you can use. And then synonyms, a lot of times, you know, even if your student studies all the vocab lists in the world, they might get a word that they don't know. They have to know how to approach that. They can look for word parts, process of elimination, have they heard that word in context, all of those kinds of things. So some ways to incorporate this, definitely I'd recommend doing practice, studying those ISEE specific vocab lists. A lot of times I tutor for the ISEE. A lot of times I have students come back and say, I saw the words we studied. They get pretty excited about that. Another thing is just using like big words in daily life. Even if your child doesn't know the meaning of all the words you use, those contexts will help them. So a lot of times I'll have a kid say, you know, I don't know that word, but my mom uses it when we're cooking and when she means this. So they get a sense of what those kinds of words mean. Another thing is,
No, I didn't mean to do, I was just going to say it's so important to give them at this age, because you're talking about fourth and fifth graders, some agency in figuring it out. The comment about looking up unfamiliar words is so empowering. But I would encourage people to actually have an old-fashioned paper dictionary around, maybe on the kitchen table. Don't look it up on a device. Look it up on in a paper dictionary, because they'll see more than just that one word, and that can be a really good way for them to start to take in new information.
Yeah, I definitely agree, especially for words with those prefixes. So for example, the ben we talk about a lot is like a good thing, like benefit. They're going to see all those beneficial, all those ben words next to each other. That can be really helpful as well.
Yeah.
So the next section we're going to talk about is reading comprehension. So 25 questions, 5 passages, 5 questions each. They have 25 minutes. So just some context, these passages might be narratives, they might be nonfiction, they might be persuasive, but they're all pretty straightforward. So some other tests have more like literary poetry. We don't have that on the ISEE. The ISEE is really more straightforward, but again, higher level reading. It is a lot of more academic, and it might just be a little bit more challenging than what your child is used to seeing at school. The question types fall into 3 main buckets. The first is main idea. So after every passage, they're pretty much always asked in some way, what's the main idea of the passage? Then they're asked for specific details. So that's going back for evidence, finding it in the passage. And then they're asked to make inferences about what they read. So consolidating information and coming up with their own idea. And so just to dive a little bit deeper, there's also questions about, in addition to main idea, details, inference. Some of those are broken more into author's perspective. So what does the author think about this? Why did they write this? Tone is a big one that kids usually are not so familiar with. And then they're asked to see vocabulary in context. So to prepare, definitely I'd recommend doing practice sections. These questions really repeat themselves. So the more sections your child's, not to do a million sections, but if they do a few sections, they're going to start seeing the same question types over and over. And it becomes, there's different strategies to answering each question. And the more successful they are with the certain question types, they'll get used to it. There's not going to be a lot of surprises on the test. Another big thing with reading is timing. If you know that your child is a slower reader, even if they're like an average paced reader, it's a fast test. It's 5 full sections, 5 questions per section in 25 minutes. So some students, especially slower readers, might need to even work through strategies of read the first paragraph, last paragraph, first sentence, find those questions in the text. They might not have time to read it all the way through. They might have to really approach this from a test-taking lens.
Yeah, and that's really important because here is absolutely, I agree, a place where the strategy may be more significant than the content, because some children, perhaps if they're slower readers or if it's just the way they approach information, they may start to lose a little stamina around the reading comprehension section. And so if they're empowered to know, look, you're going to be asked questions and it's pretty easy to identify where it's coming from. But if you're tasked with, reading the entire passage, they may not get to the questions. And we don't like them to omit questions. We like them to make informed guesses. That's usually much more productive for them.
Mm-hmm. And so in addition to those practice sections, I also really encourage families to talk to their children about what the kids are reading for fun. So a lot of these questions, there is the test prep aspect of it, but a lot of the content is really useful in regular life. So when your child is reading, ask them to succinctly synthesize the main idea of what they're reading. Ask them for details, ask them, specific questions that they need to go back and support. Talk to them about why the author wrote a certain book or wrote an article. And I also would recommend, if your child is asking about anything going on in the world or, anything about science, encourage them to go read articles and learn from articles. That's definitely, it's going to help them in all aspects of their life, but certainly for this test. All right, so moving on to the math sections. There are 2 math sections. They're scored separately. You get a score for each. The first is quantitative reasoning and the second is math achievement. So for quantitative reasoning, that's going to be a little bit more critical thinking heavy. So it's going to be more word problems, more problems put where it takes information you already know and you're asked to apply it to a new situation. Math achievement's a bit more straightforward. It asks you the questions and you answer them. No calculators are allowed and it's all multiple choice. Okay. Adriana, do you want to talk a little bit about content?
So I think it's important to know in the math sections that there is content on this test, and the majority of the content your children have not been taught in school yet. So it can seem extraordinarily daunting to them. The math achievement subtest, they're looking at a number of different, it's not one kind of math. They're looking at geometry, algebraic concepts, number sense, their measurement. They're looking at different mathematical approaches, and you may see a student who's really strong in one and weak in another. That's extremely common. Often it aligns to what they've been taught in school or perhaps haven't been taught in school. We also have to take into consideration that these children, as well as with a lot of our older children that we've seen, have fundamentally missed some school. So in first grade, I have lots of kids who did not do a units of measurement, section in first grade because it was COVID times and things were complicated. So you want to make sure in the math achievement area, particularly, that you understand where your child may be either struggling with the content or B, sort of just, feels confident enough in the content, but doesn't quite know how to approach the testing, the strategy around the testing. So, but I also think, please don't, parents often see this and their first response is they get frustrated with a current school. Like, I can't believe my child hasn't learned that. And that's the whole point of this test. None of the children have learned what's on this test in school yet. And that's why it makes it particularly hard for the youngest ones taking.
And one thing to keep in mind is, when we work with these students, if your child is someone who is pretty solid in math at school, a lot of this content isn't super difficult, it's just new. So if your child takes a practice test to start or a diagnostic test and doesn't do so well, it's not that it's so difficult, it's just they haven't been exposed. So that's why we recommend, kind of a longer timeline, just so they have the time to really work through all the different topics, learn them, get comfortable with them. Again, not super difficult for the average student, but just new. All right. So finally, we get to the essay. So the essay is unscored, but it is sent to schools. Schools definitely do take a look at your essay, so it's important to keep that in mind. The essays are pretty open-ended. They ask students to describe something usually. So describe your favorite subject in school, why it's your favorite, maybe describe a favorite memory with your family. Pretty open-ended and usually kind of interesting topics. So Adriana, can you talk a little bit about what are schools looking to see with these essays?
Essentially, the schools are just looking to see it as a timed writing sample. That's all it is. And they're looking to see if your child, as a fourth or fifth grader, has a very foundational ability to put thoughts into an organized response, what their writing mechanics look like, how they're able to give supporting evidence to their response, how they're able to conclude their response. So essentially the classic essay. Can they, be productive, meaning write multiple paragraphs, produce multiple paragraphs, or are they giving a 4-line response? The expectation is not that every child is the same. It's just another marker of what their file looks like. And because it is not scored, it is, important for schools. They have it on there because they want to be able to see how a student's thinking on their feet. That's another really important element to it. And many of the schools who require the ISEE are very writing heavy programs. So it's not going to knock anybody out of consideration, but it's important for them to know, okay, this is going to be an area of growth or development for this student, but we got this. That's something that an admissions team will take into consideration when looking at a student's essay.
So as I work with students on preparing for the essay, just a handful of things I note. A huge thing we talk about is quality over quantity. Admissions officers know that you only have half an hour. We're not looking for, a novel. It's much more important that they have a succinct, really high quality essay than that they're writing a lot. One thing I see a lot with kids is that they have trouble coming up with new details. So they'll come up with a couple topics and, or their main topic and a couple details, and then don't know where to go next. So one thing to work on and be mindful of is interesting, relevant details. Also, I'm seeing a lot of kids, again, this sort of speaks to where, we're at post-COVID, is I think a lot of students missed a lot of opportunity for writing. And I don't think it was, sometimes, depending on the school, not super highly prioritized when we're trying to make up for so much other lost ground. So grammar, language use, punctuation, formatting, those things might not be as ingrained in some students these days. So that's something to just keep an eye out for. To prepare, definitely we recommend practice essays. One thing I find really successful is when a student writes an essay, discuss 1, 2, and maximum 3 points you want to improve for the next essay. If you throw 7 things at them, they're not going to improve on those. Work on 1 to 2 things once they master those topics, then move on to the next thing. Another thing is encourage your child to write in a journal. Just write, a lot of these kids that I work with anyway, are not necessarily writing by hand very much, and they don't have very many opportunities. So writing in a journal, writing letters to people, just opportunities to write in general, organize thoughts on paper are really helpful.
Yeah, that's very important because there is also the element of again, they're not being graded on this, and it's not a handwriting competition, but if their handwriting is challenged, which some kids it is, and that's okay. It's just they need to know that. They need to know that. And sure, most kids are going to be keyboarding through most of middle and high school, but they have to be able to sit down and use a pencil too.
Mhm. One last thing I want to mention is, again, with those interesting relevant details, sometimes I work with students where I say, okay, and what else? And they can't even generate like a new detail. So I would encourage you, even in conversation with your child, if they're telling you about a certain thing that happened that day, they give you a brief answer, encourage them, okay, what else? What are other relevant, interesting details that help flesh this out for me? And just practicing that even in conversation can be helpful on the test. Okay, so moving on, a handful of additional things to think about. One is timing. I know we touched on this already, but it is a fast-paced test. So you want to be mindful of timing. You want to have your child take at least 1 or 2 practice tests ahead of the real thing so that if there are timing issues, you're aware of it, you're working on it. Another thing is bubbling. It's depending on where your child goes to school. They may or may not be familiar with bubble sheets. I think as adults, we think it's intuitive. Let me tell you, it is not. So children might need a little practice with that bubbling. Stamina and focus. This is a really long test for kids this age. And, we don't want to torture your child, have them sit for hours and hours and hours, but they need opportunities to practice maintaining that stamina and focus. They will get 2 breaks during the official test, but still, it's a very long test. So they should have opportunities to sit and do maintained work ahead of the real test.
Yeah, there's definitely a training element to this. They should be practicing full sections regularly. So then when they sit down to do their full length practice tests, they know they can do it because they know what a section is. But it's not fair to just put a child in front of this test because they've never typically taken anything like this. And it can be very daunting and psychologically draining.
I also want to mention anxiety around test taking. So there's a handful of things to keep in mind. A lot of especially high achieving students who are used to getting 100% or close to 100% on every test, this is not a test where we're expecting 100%. You can get a very good score with 80% correct, and that's very unfamiliar to students. So really, before they even start prepping, as they're going through preparation, really framing it to them that this is a different kind of test than you're seeing at school. It is okay not to know all the information. Almost nobody knows all the information. It is okay. Just making that abundantly clear so that kids aren't beating themselves up if they're not getting 100%. Another thing is the why behind the work. So at this age especially, buy-in is important. So you want students to know why they're doing this, why they're preparing, why this is important. But we don't want to put too much pressure on students this age. They can get very stressed out, and it's easy to have some misunderstandings about, like, if I don't do well, I'm not going to get into school, and we don't want that either. So again, the framing on parents' part, on educators' part is really important about we're trying to find the most appropriately challenging school. We want you to do your best, because if you don't do your best, you might end up at a school that moves too slowly, or you might find yourself bored. But we don't want you at a school where everything's moving super fast paced and you're behind and you can't keep up either. We want to find the right spot for you, which is why you want to do your best on this test. All right. So now we're going to jump into scoring. So the way this test is scored, you get 4 scores, 1 for verbal, reading, quantitative, and math achievement. Scoring is based on the student's percentile rank, so how they do in comparison to their peers. And that is then converted into a STAY-9 score. So the STAY-9s are 1 through 9, and they're directly correlated to percentile. Those STAY-9s are based on a bell curve. So because of the way it works, it's extremely difficult to get a 9 in a section. That is usually 0 to 1 questions wrong. 8, also quite difficult. Usually, again, it depends on the section, depends how the students do, but typically that's 1 to 3 questions wrong. 7 becomes a bit more attainable. That's usually like 3 or 4 to like 7 or 8 questions wrong. And then kind of the gulf gets wider as it goes towards that 5. All right. When can your child take the test? So they can take it once per season. So there are 3 testing seasons. There's fall, winter, and spring, summer. So for students on the regular admissions timeline, typically kids take it once in the fall and once in the winter. One thing to be mindful of is most schools don't want you taking it before the fall. So even if you get a very early start, it doesn't really benefit you to like take it before August. And then we would typically recommend students take it once in like October usually, and then again plan to take it in December. The very latest you can take it is early January for admissions, and I wouldn't recommend that. It makes holidays a bit stressful. Another thing to keep in mind is some students want to take it really early, like in August. It's just if your student does choose to retake it a second time, that's a lot of space between the first and second test that you're going to have to be maintaining. So that's why sometimes we say October is good, because if you take it in October, then you have a month and a half to prep for the next test, which is more appropriate than 4 months. All right, Adriana, do you want to talk a little bit about?
Sure, absolutely. And so when registration opens for the test, you have options. You're going to pick where your child is going to sit for the test. And there are places where they can test, say, at a school. Sometimes perhaps their school offers testing, depending what, what the exit point of that school is. So if it's K-5 school, they will likely do on-site testing. Regional testing, a school like Rye Country Day in Rye often is a testing site. And when a child takes a test in that setting, it will be in a room with a proctor and other students who are sitting for the same test. It will be a paper test with a pencil. And, for a lot of kids this age, that is most appropriate. There's also the option, and this came about during COVID, to do virtual testing at home. Sometimes it's a matter of when you can get a test date, and you can't get an in-person test, but you can get a virtual test. That is, for many of the families I work with, my least favorite option, because I often tell people that I think students can be a little too comfortable at home and they don't have the mindset that, okay, I'm doing something. Now, Leila, I know, has seen the opposite effect and seen some kids be extremely successful with in-home testing. It really comes down to who your learner is. I have also seen some challenges with their technology. And so that's just something to bear in mind. Now, a Prometric Center, which they have them all over the world, are also places where a student can go and sit for the test. It will be a computer-based virtual administration at the Prometric Center, and Prometric Centers are places that offer all sorts of testing. They're not just ERB tests. You might have somebody taking their Series 7 test there, or some other, or maybe an SSAT. And a lot of families will use that option because it can be a little bit of a scramble to get paper test dates. There are also some people out there who you can work with directly, educational psychologists who can administer a test. But I think the most important thing for you to know is who your child is and what sort of a setting they will be most comfortable in. And a paper test is going to be most like the experience of going to school and sitting for a test. The Prometric Center is going to be a little bit unfamiliar to them, but it gets them out of the house, and then a virtual test at home. Some kids may do very well and some may be a little too comfortable. And we do want just a little bit of an edge of, I want to bring my best self to this. So it's really about your child and what you think would be best for them.
Yeah, I agree. I think as we see with older students, sometimes typing the essay is a real push towards virtual, but I do think at this age, most students are pretty comfortable with handwriting, don't do significantly better with virtual.
Mhm.
I think in home, I did work with a student who really was much more successful if he was able to read questions out loud for math.
Mhm.
So that is one reason to do in home, something to consider. But again, that was
Yeah.
one student. It really worked for him. But I agree with Adriana. I think distractions, siblings, being in home, it can get very.
And we've seen things like signal, like Wi-Fi signal go out. We've
Mhm,
seen they use it's an AI proctor,
mhm.
and we've seen that go a little haywire before. So I would just say think carefully about what's going to set your child up for success. If you're going through all of this process, getting ready for testing, then don't register for in-home just because it feels most convenient for you.
Mhm.
Register for the best setting for your child.
Yeah. All right. So speaking of registration, as Adriana mentioned, especially those paper test dates can be a bit of a scramble. So typically dates are released right at the start of the testing season. Register that morning. So August 1st, set it in your calendar. That is that morning, set aside time to register for a test. They go unbelievably quickly. I know on my end as a tutor and, in my position here, I have a lot of families I talked to on August 2nd who asked me like, how could this be?
Mhm.
So they do sometimes add dates throughout the season, but that's not
Mhm.
super reliable. You don't really know when that's happening. So I would really recommend trying to get your date booked, even as early as you can, the winter date booked, I would recommend. And then in terms of accommodations, if your child does have accommodations, it's a bit less of a scramble. They do reserve seats for students with accommodations in person. And so that process is actually very clearly outlined on the ERB website. So I would
Mhm.
visit there. You will have to request an accommodation form. You're going to have to send in documentation. You're going to have to get some supporting documentation from your school. Again, very clearly outlined on the ERB website, but I wouldn't wait. I would definitely, again, at the very start of the testing season, reach out immediately and get those accommodations approved because it can take
Yeah.
several weeks.
And it once you've got them, then you've got them. So, but
Mhm.
you have to do that first.
Yeah. And again, several weeks. So some families try to do it last minute and we do it early. All right.
So this is interesting because parents always want to know, how does the school that they're applying to value a test score? And the answer is there's no one answer. I think it's really important for you to know that your child is not sitting for college exams. This is not the ACT or SAT. And particularly at the lower level, there is a keen understanding of how hard this test is, and that these sort of little kids are really being tasked with something really, really challenging. So it's simply one part of an application file. So, what are other elements to the file, right? There's going to be their transcript from school, recommendations from teachers. They will go to the school they're applying to. Some of those schools do their own assessments as well. Some will, you know, will ask them in interviews to do a little bit of problem solving. Every school has their own unique way of doing it. It is, as the slide says, a simple additional piece of data. It does not make or break their file, particularly at the fifth, sixth grade entry. Be very wary of people out there. There's always a lot of bad information on the street, and a lot of people will start to assign numbers to schools, stay nine numbers. You can't apply to school X unless you have all eights. That is untrue. And unless that person had been, a senior enrollment director at that school, they probably have no idea what they're talking about. So I think it's really, really important to be mindful that this is just one part of the story, and it is not weighted sort of at a 50% of the application. Each school will look at it their own way. I do think it's important to know that many schools who have been test optional over the last few cycles, sort of on the heels of COVID in the midst, are moving away from that. So if you are going to be doing an admissions process for 5th or 6th grade in the fall, you should have the expectation that your child will be testing, and schools haven't necessarily updated that information yet on their web pages, but several have told us they are moving back to testing. It's just one piece of data that helps them understand the student's overall profile. So that's important to know. But it is not, it is not it. It is not the whole story.
Great. All right, so how should my child prepare for the ISEE? So, we've learned a lot about it. So what's next? I would really recommend starting with a diagnostic test. So that's going to help us. A diagnostic test is they'll sit for a mock test, a practice, and again, be so clear that they're not going to know a lot of the information, and that's okay. But this really helps us zero in on where do they need to do more work, where are they already doing well. It gives you an idea of how much preparation they're going to need, a realistic idea of a timeline. And so once you have those diagnostic test scores and you see your child is either doing really well or they're struggling a bit, Adriana, I'm so sorry. I just got a notification that my Wi-Fi is a little unstable. So if I cut out, just let me know. Okay. But so basically, just back to this, you map out a testing timeline once you have your diagnostic scores. And then that'll help you decide, what kind of supports your child might need. Another thing to keep in mind is, what is your child doing this summer? So if you are traveling this summer, if your child is going to camp this summer, you're going to need to maybe start a little earlier and then maybe make a concrete plan for August when you come back, and make sure you use those times. I would not recommend planning to do a lot of work if you're traveling, especially if you have a busy schedule or if your child goes to camp. I occasionally talk to families who, wonder whether their child should bring work to camp. I don't really recommend it. Usually it stresses kids out. They don't get a lot done. Let them enjoy their summer. But definitely if your child is going to camp, you want to think through, how are you going to use the last couple months of the school year? And then how are you going to use the months before next school year starts?
And one thing you can do if your child is going to camp is, make sure that they're bringing books with them to camp. And if they're not big readers, they don't need to be heavy, serious books. They don't need to bring War and Peace to camp. But, if they like graphic novels, but make sure they're bringing something, and that the language is perhaps a little bit too sophisticated for them. So they're going to be thinking and trying to puzzle it out, because that's a really good use of their time. That's a way, at least, to get them, critically thinking, and you can gamify it. You can make it fun. You can say, okay, let's have a reading challenge while you're gone. And listen, not every child will buy into that. I know that well, but you can say, I'm trying to read more, your mom. I'm going to try to read 3 books while you're at camp. Or how many books are you going to try to read? And then, when you write letters back and forth, maybe it comes up. But you don't want to send them with a giant prep book with the expectation they're going to be doing 20 minutes a day, because it's A, super unlikely that they will be, and B, it just is a stress piece. They're going to look at it on their shelf at camp for 6 weeks thinking like, oh, I'm just avoiding this and I'm going to get in trouble when I get home. So, that's something to think about.
Yeah. One useful tip we used to talk about when teaching was, if you're trying to find a book that's appropriately challenging for your child, have them read 1 page. there should be more than one word they don't know, but there shouldn't be more than 5. So have them count on their fingers how many words they don't know. So that'll keep them learning, but they'll still be able to grasp the content. Yes, but overall diagnostic tests, slow and steady studying. Again, it's not super difficult information. It is a lot of new information. So slow and steady is really the key here. So preparation options. There are a handful of different options for preparing. Of course, there's the private tutoring. And so this can be really beneficial for students. You get that one-on-one attention. You move at a pace that's exactly right for your child, works around your schedule. And also your child is getting the highest impact feedback at all times. Another option is small group tutoring. So we actually offer tutoring for groups of 3 to 6 students. We will be offering a couple courses at the end of the summer, but also if your child, if you know they have 2 good friends who are also working on the ISEE, we can build a program for you that works around your schedule. So the perk to small group tutoring is it can be more affordable than private tutoring, but you still get that high level of personalized attention from a tutor, and also space to like discuss, ask questions easily, personalize assignments, and then you kind of get that social collaborative aspect, and it makes kids feel like they're not alone in the process.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and sometimes, in a healthy competition way, you can see growth. And that can be really positive and productive.
Some students get overwhelmed when it's just them with a private tutor. But some students, again, small group and private, it kind of depends on your child. Class, it's not so common at this age. It's more for older students. We see class offerings. I would just be aware that for this age, like even for older students, we say that's good for a self-motivated student. I do think at this age, it can be a bit challenging. Can be helpful in keeping kids on pace and going over the overview and some of the trickier content. But I would just be aware that at this age, kids are coming from pretty dramatically different school backgrounds and different, like they've been exposed to a lot of different things. It may be a bit challenging. And then finally, independent study. So at this age, independent study, I do think means parent guidance. And so definitely, again, the content isn't super difficult. As a parent, you can walk your child through this. A couple of things to be aware of, though, is it is quite a strategy-heavy test. I would do a lot of research about the strategies used. We've even had parents who do a handful of sessions with a tutor where the parent, child, and tutor all sit together so they can see how the tutor is teaching their child with those strategies in mind, and then take those strategies to continue on. Also, if you do choose to do private tutoring, I know that our ISEE tutors work very collaboratively with parents. So if you want to support your child outside of tutoring, you're aligned. But I would just be mindful that with the independent study, another thing to consider is sometimes kids prefer not to learn from their parents. That can add challenges. So I talked to some families who have tried that and they're like, my child just doesn't want to learn from me. And I'm like, that's common. So just, again, it's family to family, it's child to child, but just something to be aware of. In terms of materials, there are a lot of workbooks. I personally, when I tutor, I really like the Tutorverse lower level workbook. I think it's very well organized. The content matches the level that's on the test, but that's just mine. I haven't seen all the workbooks.
I agree.
Yeah.
I like the Tutorverse books too. And I think they're highly regarded. Agree.
Okay. So again, there are others, but that is just one that we like. And then Test Innovators. So Test Innovators is an online platform. With it, you get 7 full-length tests, which are printable in case you want to do it on paper. And then there are like thousands of practice questions. So we do really like Test Innovators just because of the breadth of the content. It is so much. Families find that usually it's appropriate for a full course of tutoring. And also it provides really helpful analytics. So that can be really beneficial as well.
Yeah, and they use retired real tests.
Yeah. So they use one retired test. And then, but the rest, it really is the same caliber. Usually I talk to students who come back from the real test and I did check in because we aren't able to see the real test, and I check in
Yeah.
with the students. They all confirm it's the same caliber of difficulty.
Yeah.
With Test Innovators, just a note, because we have worked with them, we really love their product. Now we partner with them and we're able to get a discount. So even if you don't do tutoring with us, we are happy to set you up with a Test Innovator account, which you can use outside of us with anyone else. But we just have that 15% discount. So if you want to sign up for that, just reach out to me. I'm happy to get you set up.
And it's very user friendly,
Mm.
the Test Innovators interface. So your student, it's very intuitive. They won't feel like, what am I navigating here? And that's something that matters for a lot of kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my lower level students, I've never had anyone have any major issues with it.
Yeah.
All right, Adriana, you want to talk a little about burnout?
Yeah, I mean, it's so important that your child who is going to go through an admissions process is still able to be themselves. And so they need to get familiar with what's expected of them on this test. And they, depending on what sort of schools you might be targeting, put the effort in, but that doesn't mean that they're doing hours of study a day. That's a not productive strategy because they will get tired of it, they will get resentful, and it does not leave them time for their interests or their curiosity. And they're really young and they really, really need to be developing those things. So, again, it's going to look really different for every child. And some children are excited to have a workbook. There are some, fourth and fifth graders who that's an exciting thing. If that's who your child is and you're traveling over the summer and they want to bring the workbook, okay. But if that's not who your child is, just let them have the experience of traveling because they need to store up their own mental reserves for this process. This admissions process is not simply a test, as we talked about before. And so it's important to pace it for them. And it's important to give them a little agency, ask them, what are you finding? What are you finding that's interesting? What are you finding that's hard? Always be a little bit inquisitive about it. But, until you get into the real crunch time, which is the testing season, you don't want to take away things from them. You don't want to take away Little League. You don't want to take away, swim class or pottery or dance or whatever it is, because if that's something they love, that's giving them a lot of joy and that makes them a more interesting admissions candidate and it makes them a more settled child. And there's no one right set of test scores that they need to be achieving. So you have to give them a little space to explore. And some children are extremely sensitive and really shut down. You don't want to build up anxiety around testing because they've got a lot of tests in their future. And there is really no question that they're going to be testing for college. This should not be not fun, but it should not be a miserable experience for them. So it should be much more a process, just a laid out plan to, exactly slow and steady, just chunk it out and cross things off and, with the goal being have them show up for the test day feeling like they know what's expected of them. That's the real thing.
Also, just something to add. So I know with my kids I work with tutoring. So I typically at this age, if we do a 1 hour session per week, I'll do about an hour of work outside of the session. And usually that's sufficient to get a kid where they need to be, 2 hours of work per week. Something to be mindful of is kids this age have a really hard time. I've found understanding like, what is an hour a week? What is 3 hours a week? What's 5 hours a week? So when you come up with a plan with your child, I try, at least for the first few weeks, at the end of each week, I check in. Did that seem like a lot? Did that seem like you could do more? Did that seem comfortable? And, adjust accordingly. If a child is telling you it felt like a lot of work, they've got a long road until the test. So you don't want them to feel like that. So work with your child, check in. I would really recommend asking them how they feel for the first few weeks.
Yeah, I totally agree. And be particularly mindful about how they're going to be able to work. Do they need to come sit at the kitchen table, dining room table, so they're not distracted by their room? Do they need to, you set them up for success? And an hour a week, is that 1 hour or is it 3 20-minute chunks? It's just going to be different for every child, but you've got to start in the space of knowing your child.
And in terms of stamina, I know we talked about working longer stretches, building stamina. That's not really necessary until like maybe 6 to 8 weeks before the test you start doing that. If you're starting to prep now for an October test, they don't need to be sitting for full-length tests multiple times right now. I would say 6 to 8 weeks before the test, you want them to start doing more practice sections to get that stamina built.
Agreed.
All right, now fun ways to build skills. Again, as Adriana was saying, and I think we've mentioned it a few times, we don't want this to be a total slog. There's a lot of fun ways to start building. So one thing is word games, crosswords, online word games, the New York Times puzzles and fun things like that, Boggle, Scrabble, anything that exposes them to new words. Again, you can chat about prefixes, suffixes, word parts, roots. This word sounds like that word, and what does that mean? Where did it come from? Anything, if you can get excited and a little nerdy with your kid, that is going to help them out.
Yeah, definitely.
Integrating vocab words into life. We already touched on this, but again, even if start using those big words with your kids, because if they start hearing them from you, they might ask what they mean. Even if they don't, they're gonna learn a sense of what they mean. They're at that fun age where their brains are wired to pick up new vocabulary. So if you just start using those words, they'll start knowing them. We talked about discussing the reading they're already doing. Math challenges. There's a lot of fun online games that have challenges. There's some games, you can purchase that incorporate a lot of math into like a board game setting. You can also, sometimes kids get really excited to show off what kind of advanced math they're learning. That's more advanced in the curriculum. If they can go into class and they learn I've had kids come in, they're like, we just started the slope unit at school, but I already know everything. They get really excited about that. So that can be a really fun way to engage the kids. We talked about journal entries and writing letters. Another fun thing is tutoring a younger sibling. That's big, is if they can teach a younger sibling, if they can read over their essays and help with punctuation or grammar, if they can, even if their younger sibling's learning fractions and they already know it, it helps really ingrain. Teaching it is like the highest level of understanding. So if they can teach a younger sibling addition or fractions or anything like that, that's a good foundational review for them and helps them deepen their understanding.
Or even also, absolutely on the math, that's really, really important. But also on the reading. If their younger sibling is just progressing to chapter books and, for the older sibling to sit there and read aloud, reading aloud is really, really a helpful way. They will, if they come across a word, they're not quite sure if they have to break it down, they're going to start thinking of the word parts. And it's a really low stress way for them to be gaining great content in for them that they'll use for this test, but also it's just it works really, really well. And if they don't have a younger sibling, maybe it's a neighbor, maybe it's a cousin, but it is really a great way to get kids invested by putting them in the role of sort of leader around learning.
Even if you, again, I was going to also say, if they don't have a younger sibling, if they don't have a parent, some kids do respond well. If you explain to them that this is helping deepen their understanding, I've seen kids really buy into teaching a stuffed animal, teaching a parent, just as a way of practice if they have that buy-in to and the understanding this is going to help my brain develop.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so just to review recommended next steps, I would really recommend scheduling a diagnostic test, get a sense of where your kid's starting point is. In order to do that, we'll have my contact information. If you just send me an email, I am happy to send along all information needed, all next steps. After you get your diagnostic scores, I will give you a call back and I will chat with you about what they mean and how to make a plan. If you don't even know if you want that diagnostic test yet, I am also just happy to hop on the phone. We can have a introduction call. I'll give you your options. I can talk you through them. Just any questions you might have about your specific situation that we may not have covered or might differ from the usual. I'm really happy to talk those all through. If you just send me an email, we can schedule a call. All right, so we're going to get to frequently asked questions. And then after that, we will take questions from anyone who is here. I also noticed some, I was about to say some friends as if we're in a classroom, but some attendees hopped on a little bit late. So we will have this link available to this whole webinar. It's recorded. We will send that to you afterwards. So if you missed anything in the beginning, you can go back and watch that.
Okay.
So first question, Adriana, can we super score your test?
Not in an official way. And so what does super score mean? That means taking the best score from each subtest and combining it with the other best score. So say a child is testing in October and January, although Leila told you not to test in January, but sometimes you have to. And they got a 4 on the reading comp in October, but a 7 in January, which is wonderful growth if they did. But the rest of the October test was stronger than the January test. Is there a way that they can combine the two sets of scores to report to the schools, which is something you can do in your SAT or your ACT? You cannot do this in any sort of official way. But what you can do, and this is school by school, and this goes right into the next question, potentially there's a value in sending both sets of scores, but it's very much based on who your child is and what schools you're applying to. And I would not say there's an advantage to sending multiple sets of scores, but if one test is showing something markedly different and that's much more like who they are than the other test, you may want to send both. But that's a very individualized piece. And it's something that we talk about with our clients or the schools we work with. For the most part, admissions teams don't want to be looking at two sets of scores. And that's something for you to know. So this next question, if I have a high, low versus middle of the road, which do I send? It's tricky, right? There's no one universal answer. But I would say that depending on what schools you're talking about, depending on what your child really typically demonstrates as a learner, if the middle of the road is kind of more reflective of who they are as a student. I want to be really clear about what middle of the road means, because middle of the road in the context of an ISEE is not middle of the road. This is a tiny sample of students taking this test for private school admission. And you on a national norm level, middle of the road for ISEE is really top of the heap for national norms. So I think you should be really thoughtful. There's no shame in being middle of the road. It's not like, oh, I got a 55 on my test, I did a really bad job. That's not it. Getting a 5 on the ISEE is not bad. It's not a bad score. So oftentimes what I like people to be able to demonstrate, if they can, is evenness. And if the middle sort of scores are more even than, we're really crushing it in the math, but we're struggling in the verbals, I would go for the middle scores. it's nice to present your child as a more even learner, if that's who they are. Not every child is that. And, as far as if the school is test optional, we're in a bit of a wait and see period right now, but I would say to you, there's very little value in sending a test to a test optional school unless it's a certain circumstance. And so what might those circumstances be? If you are coming from a public school and the principal is not going to allow your teachers to write recommendations. There are a few out there. So then your child's admissions file is going to be sort of scant compared to somebody else's. If there's an expectation of a graded writing sample, but your child does not come from a school who does graded writing, and I've seen that a lot, particularly at this level, is there value in sending the test? Could be, because then they have the essay, they have a timed writing sample. So it's really dependent on a few other factors, but more is not always better, but there can be reasons for it. And these admissions teams really put a lot of time and consideration into each individual file. So if you go into this process knowing my child's file is not going to have X, Y, and Z, because they don't really do that, then yeah, sure, I would send a test score just to give them one more data point, as we talked about, to evaluate. Mostly you want a plan. You just want to go into a testing season with a plan, and fully knowing that you may have to adapt the plan along the way, but that's really how you do yourself and your child a favor.
Yeah. And so if you have any questions, please feel free. Again, you can email Adriana with any admissions related questions. I am happy to support with any testing related questions. Thank you again, everyone, for coming. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be here. As a reminder, we have our promotion. So if you purchase 4 or more sessions, we will add a complimentary session free with one of our tutors. You can reach out to me again for that diagnostic test, private or group tutoring, for a Test Innovators account. I'm happy to support. If you just want to talk about the testing timeline specifically in regards to your child, I am happy to do so. So thank you so much again. And remember, we're always here to support in your test prep and admissions journey. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.